So we've got our second keynote speech of this conference, and I have to say it's a real privilege actually to be introducing this speaker. I mean, he does have, I think, one of the most impressive biographies that I've seen in quite a long time. Howard A. Schmidt has a very long distinguished career both in public service and in high-ranking positions in industry, and combining the two I think is unusual. He has served as Vice Chair and then Chair of the President's Critical Infrastructure Protection Board, and also as the Special Advisor for Cyberspace Security for the White House. And that was between 2001 and 2003. In industry, I mean, just some of his more recent positions include, what do I have here? Chief Information Security Officer and Chief Security Strategist for eBay. And he previously served time, if that's the right phrase, as Chief Security Officer for Microsoft. He's now President and CEO of, I presume, your own consulting firm, yes, which is R&H Security Consulting. So we are just really delighted to be able to welcome a speaker with quite so much personal experience of dealing with security issues as Howard A. Schmidt. Howard, would you like to come up?
Thank you so much, and it's indeed an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I appreciate you not reading the rest of that, because at one juncture, someone actually read the entire 15-page story of my life, and someone said, well, what was it like to work for President Abraham Lincoln? And I wasn't quite sure how to take that one. Anyway, before I get started, I do want to share one really quick video clip with you. Peter Swire and I were talking during the lunch break, and I was telling him that it's indeed, as I mentioned, a pleasure and an honor to be here, but it's also one of the challenging positions because they just dim the lights. It's right after lunch, and so my job is to try to keep everyone napping nicely and quietly during the next 30 minutes or so. So what I did was I purchased the DVD River Dance, and I was practicing in the hotel last night about 2 a.m. till the knock on the door said, would you please stop whatever you're doing? So I didn't quite finish all the moves, so instead of doing the river dance, tap dance for the next 15 minutes to keep everyone awake, I thought I'd share with you what I consider to be an accurate representation of where we are in the transition of technology from where we have been in the past, particularly in office automation, to where we all are today in the IT enterprise. And I hope you share this opinion with me, because I think it's very, very relevant. So if you would bear with me. Do that one more time. Now, some people didn't remember. I did this recently at an event in the U.S., and a few of the younger folks in the audience had no idea what this was. And then I made the second mistake, and it was sort of a technical discussion about the way data resides on magnetic media, and I was talking about how it's very similar to the way an LP vinyl album, that the tracks are laid down on that, and of course people that have never seen anything except CDs had no idea what I was talking about either. So I think the retirement is coming sooner than I had thought. Anyway, I want to take about 30 minutes, I guess, and sort of frame the new enterprise, as many of us are calling it now. And I'll explain what I mean by that in just a moment, if you would. But I want to lay one other piece of interesting information that I recently had shared with me by a CEO of a company in the U.S. He's from France originally, and he was talking about some of the things that we see relative to security and some of the mistakes I think we're making in the world today. And he's a history buff, and particularly early European history. And he was talking about the in 1588, which I presume none of us were around here for that one either, during the British victory over the Spanish Armada. And for those of you who have studied the history, which of course as a young man I did as well, and one of the big things about that was to secure the shipping lanes. And they were very successful in defeating the army because they were trying to make sure that they had the shipping lanes kept open. And at one point, one of us used an analogy at the White House about the internet is basically like the open shipping lanes. You know, whether it's a pleasure craft, a cruise ship, a military warship, a submarine, the pathways need to be kept open. And we recognize that in the internet world. Well, the correlation between the events in 1588 and today are the fact today we oftentimes are still worried about securing our borders while the shipping lanes are being attacked over and over and over again. And I thought it was interesting when he brought this up, because at first I was thinking, well, I didn't quite get that. But when you really get down to think about it, you look at the level of commerce that we're doing through the internet today, you look at the commerce level in 1588 and the mechanism by which commerce was accomplished, and clearly there's a direct correlation, because the success of commerce over the high seas, or the internet of the day, if you would, depended on keeping those shipping lanes open. It also was another factor there was the trust and reliability of when you sent your ship out loaded with gold or loaded with spices wherever you were coming from, there was the hope, the actual hope that you would actually reach your destination without being hijacked, sunk, all the other myriad of things that might have happened, both natural and man-made, that wouldn't keep you from doing your job. And so clearly there's a lot of correlations between the two, and the old adage about those that don't study history are doomed to repeat it. And in this case, I think that's very, very relevant. So some of the key points I want to cover here in the next 25 minutes or so is, one, can the internet itself and digital data more broadly be protected by technology alone? So I think oftentimes, particularly those of us in the technology field, just write another application somewhere, write that killer application, will solve all of our problems. Also a little bit of a correlation as we did with the evolution of automobiles. Well, automobiles in the early days where criminals were robbing banks using cars and the policemen were still on horseback. Outdistancing them became very, very much an issue in a relatively short period of time. And so the evolution of catching up between the bad guys, what we're doing on the good guys' side, is something we have to deal with as well. Then, of course, try to touch a little bit on some of the international perspectives relative to privacy and security. And as Mary Rundle, I don't know if Mary's in here now or not, but as we were talking last night at dinner, and I missed your presentation this morning, but I feel secure in saying that the concept of without security you have no privacy was probably an underlying theme of much that gets talked about. So one of the first things that I think we look at is, why are we in this mess to begin with? And I think the easiest thing is we never developed a system to be secure. We never developed a system to be worried about people's privacy. We developed a system because it was a good way to collaborate from researchers to government researchers and to be able to pass information in a very, very open environment. So consequently, we didn't design anything to be more secure and respect particularly international privacies. The other thing is once it was realized that there was a need to do something like that, particularly in the U.S. government, there came a document called the Orange Book. I think many of you here are probably familiar with the early days of the Orange Book. And a colleague of mine went about immediately as soon as that book came out and built one of the first A1 compliance systems, which effectively was about as secure as anyone could have and still plug it into the wall. And they were not able to sell one of them because you couldn't do anything with it. And so it was clear at that point there had to be some trade-offs somewhere in security and privacy. So consequently, the idea of having the absolute security and the technology perspective was sort of given up on. The other thing that I'd like to point out that I think puts us in the mess that we're in is part of the development process that we've gone through over the years. Now, many of us have lived from the days, particularly in my civil service life, where we had what we called GOTS, government owned systems and stuff that we built ourselves. Then, of course, we went to COTS, commercial off the shelf. And in that transition were some things that we looked at, and the biggest issue we had, first and foremost, was the fact it was much cheaper to do things in the COTS environment, the commercial off-the-shelf environment, to leverage the abilities of the internet instead of dedicated networks because it was far less expensive. And I remember the former chief of staff for the U.S. Air Force who had toured the environment we created, the first Computer Crime and Information Warfare division within the U.S. government when I was the director of the Air Force group that ran that. And he came in, I said, General, it's just one question I have. We are up to our eyeballs, literally, in doing cases around breaches into defense systems, breaches into U.S. contractor systems, breaches into universities, all because we moved from a relative open environment in the ARPANET days over to what we now call the Internet. And it wasn't much thought ahead of time about doing this in a secure manner. It was almost like one day someone woke up and said, okay, we're going to flip the switch. We're going to go from a research environment into an open world environment, and good luck with it. So why, particularly in defense, did we go this route? And the answer was very simple. It's more cost effective. And so now we're sort of paying the price for that. Now, I don't want to start out by giving the impression that things are all bad, because they're not. 3 years ago, I probably would have been much more negative than I'll be today. Clearly, we've made some great strides. We still have a long way to go, particularly in the area when we start looking at why some of the things currently occur like they do. We've got better about doing patching, but unfortunately, we've seen even just a few weeks ago with Zotab. Now we're seeing from the date of a revealing of a known vulnerability to the day the exploit actually takes place has gone from about 6 to 7 months down. In this case, the exploit code was actually out there 3 days after the vulnerability was identified and 5 days before the actual exploit was in the wild. So we've seen a tremendous shorting of time taking place in some of the exploitations happening. And what happens, Carnegie Mellon University, the CERT team there, estimates that roughly 99% of all reported intrusions into systems were not something new. We're not something that someone said, oh, gee, we figured out a new way to break into a system. These were known, widely published vulnerabilities that people had not fixed. And it's interesting because I bring this back to the physical world for a moment, and I do so for my own sanity in many cases, because I wind up living too much in the bits and bytes world, and people say, you forget what life is like in the real world. And years ago when I was a policeman, we talked about vulnerability disclosure in the physical sense. And the analogy I would draw is if one of us were to go on holiday, and our next door neighbor would go over to our house, knock on the door, and the door wasn't quite latched, and the door comes open, and you're off in Portugal for 2 weeks. If they were to all of a sudden get on the local talk radio show and say, by the way, the person living at 123 Main Street is off on holiday, and their house is wide open, because I went and I tried it, I knocked on the door, and the door was open, and I want to let people know, just so this person learns their lesson, that's a bad thing. But there's generally not some liability that's associated with that. I'm not going to come back and sue Richard or Fred for doing this, because they wouldn't do it to begin with. But the correlation there is that's an individual event. That's an impact on one person's failure to secure their activity. So let me bring up to the next level, if I may, and you look even in downtown in the square area, we have business after business with adjoining walls, oftentimes adjoining air conditioning and duct systems. So if you look at that sort of the strip mall concept, where on one end of it is a financial institution, the other end of it is a hair salon. The levels of security that are required for both of those entities are totally different. If someone breaks into the hair salon in the middle of the night and takes out a hair care product, which I don't use that much anymore, that's not a big issue. But clearly if they break into the financial services on the other end of the building, that's a big thing. That's a bank robbery in many of our cultures. But so the security pieces go in here, but what happens when the salon owner leaves their door open and goes off on holiday? Someone enters there, goes up through the ceiling way, cuts across the ductwork, and comes down into the bank and steals the money out of the bank. Very similar to the situation we have today, where the new enterprise is that my home computer system is now part of the new enterprise. So if I don't electronically lock my door, someone gets into my system, a few things can occur. One, first and foremost, there's that individual thing. And I'll talk in a few moments about identity theft and authentication and another side issue that we deal with all the time. But it's strictly a personal issue. So if they come in and steal something from me, that's my fault, it's my responsibility. Sure, I'm going to report it to the police, but the responsibility is mine to secure it or not secure it. But the second aspect of it goes beyond an effect directly to me. And this is where they then come into my system, compromise my system, and use my system as part of a larger bot network or a zombie network. Now, if we roll back to February of the year 2000, when we had the distributed denial of service attacks against some of the major internet sites, eBay, CNN, ESPN Sports. Some of the things are really important to our day-to-day life, by the way. If you can't get your sports score on ESPN, you've got a problem. But we had the distributed denial of service attacks at that at a data rate of about 800 megabits per second. Relatively high bandwidth usage at that point, because they'd compromised some universities, they'd compromised some commercial entities, with high bandwidth organizations. Well, if you bring that into today's world, with the advent of broadband in the home, whether it's cable modem or DSL activity, and you take that same power, and I'm not a mathematician, but Fred could probably do this in his head, but if you take 10,000 home users on broadband, you have them part of a bot network that launches a distributed denial of service attack. And the lowest end of the spectrum, you're talking about 2 gigabit per second data rates to do denial of service attacks. And oftentimes, you bring that up a little bit higher, you oftentimes get up to 3 gigabits. So consequently, the ability to withstand an attack like that from any commercial entity is very difficult to deal with. We see some companies getting very, very good at it, but every once in a while, when you try to get that web page and you have to get that 404 error, it may not be because the system's down for maintenance, because it's actually being subjected to a distributed denial of service attacks. And it's estimated, now we've actually been able to prove up to 50,000 home users, consumers around the world have had their systems compromised at one time and controlled by 1 or 2 different organizations involved in this sort of an environment. So that new enterprise is us. So clearly that's one piece of it. Some estimates say that worldwide, at any given moment, there's at least 250,000 broadband users that have their systems compromised for one purpose or another. And as we've seen oftentimes for over the years, going from what we used to refer to as the clever hobbyist, or the early days of the hackers, into the environment we see today where it's done for greed and for profit, we're seeing a lot of changes in the way people are being attacked. The third aspect of that is, in addition to my personal information, in addition to the distributed denial service attack, we also have the opportunity to become a gateway into someone else's environment. Now, if you think of the way most of us work in the past 5 to 6 years, my years at Microsoft, every one of us was encouraged. Matter of fact, the company would pay for our broadband connection from home. We're encouraged to work from home, to do as much as you can, for one simple reason: you were more productive. You'd go home, you pat the dog on the head, you take the children out for the walk, and then you come back in, put everybody to bed, and at 10 o'clock at night, you're back on email. You're back working on your system. So they actually encourage that sort of thing. What was not being encouraged at the time was the security that went along with it. So consequently, more than one occasion took place where someone was able to get into a local home system and use that as a gateway into a corporate enterprise. Then once inside, it oftentimes becomes a very, very easy task to elevate privilege, because even if I, as an end user, has nothing more than the privilege of looking at a few internal sites, looking at a few situations where I can, do my email and a few other shares out there and do PowerPoint documents, whatever it may be. That's the level of privilege I have. Invariably, one will come in, run an application, do a vulnerability assessment of what's out there, invariably find either an internally developed application, which a vulnerability exists in, which gives them the ability to launch into another application, which then eventually gives them the ability to launch into an application that has administrative rights or root rights across the entire enterprise, such as running backup systems, monitoring systems such as Sentry, Unicenter, Tivoli, these sort of things. Once you have that level of privilege, then you own the system. And we've seen, and I know it's oftentimes, and I know Peter's here from Australia, we often point back to Australia and the sewage treatment plant event a few years ago. I mean, we use that thing for the next 50 years, I would imagine. But there's a classic example of someone trying something over and over and over again until they were successful. So consequently, the new enterprise is not just about the corporate or the government systems, it's about all of our systems. And at the end of 2004, it was estimated there was 840 million users on the internet at the end of 2004. I don't know what the number is going to be this year, but I would presume, based on some of the growth rates that have been either estimated or proposed, that we'll see close to 1 billion users on the internet by the end of this year. That's a lot of open doors that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So the next phase of a comment I want to make is basically when we start blaming the computer systems. And it's really interesting because I had a meeting with a group of chief executives and CIOs and CEOs of various companies. And it was all about the computers are not being taken care of. We're not doing things on the computer. The computer, the computer, the computer. They kept talking about the computer system. Like the computer itself had the ability to make some sort of decision. But when you look at what goes on today and you look at the malicious code out there, in very rare cases, the computer knows the difference between a bad code and a good code. The computer only runs code. It does exactly what we developed it to do. We put a processor in there that said, when you see certain instructions sent, execute it. And that's what it's doing. Now, we have operating systems that lay on top of it. We have network operating systems. We have applications, databases that all have to be trained to understand the differences. But once again, when we look at issues that we deal with on a regular basis, I've actually had extremely, extremely talented developers. When I would tell them you do Command-Shift-Option-Delete, you put your big toe on the H key, at the same time hitting the function key, and it creates a buffer overrun, they'd say, well, why would someone do that? And the answer is simple, because they can. And then when we come up with some attempts at laws to say, to prevent people from identifying those sort of things and actually talk about prosecuting people, legitimate researchers that are looking for those sort of vulnerabilities, it was just insane, because it was the computer was doing bad things. And it's not the case at all. So basically, when we start looking at the next generation, the generation we're working into now, actually the computer's got to be able to distinguish that. We have to have the core kernel of the computer system hardened to the point where it can't be modified. And of course, in the .NET or the Windows environment, when you talk about the DLL libraries, in the early days of software piracy, and I'm not saying it's by any stretch of the imagination that has gone away, but it's just not a big of issue because we have bigger security issues to deal with. But one of the easiest ways to compromise a computer system was to provide someone with a website or in the old days, a bulletin board system which they could download pirated software. And in a communications DLL package, an executable file, all you have to do is change the legitimate one to another one, that every time it identifies the word restricted document, it then ships it off to someplace else. We wouldn't know that. Without specifically looking for some sort of unusual activity, all we see is that little light blinking on and off as the data is being transmitted. And if I may digress for a moment, because I have a really, what I think is a tragic, funny story about the little light blinking on and off. As many of you know, and I presume in your own home environments, your business environments, anything goes wrong with the computer system, you become the CIO for your family, neighborhood, friends, coworkers, etc. You get the call, come and fix it, it's not doing something right. My dad is 90 years old, lives in Florida. He's been using computers for about the past 15 years now, and every year I have to buy him a new one because he sees that it goes from 1.8 megahertz speed to 2.0, and he wants that because it's faster. He doesn't know the difference, by the way, but he wants one. So then he discovered that he no longer had to dial 7 numbers and log in at 56 kilobits per second. He can actually get this thing called broadband. And now he becomes a personal spam factory. But he also is the local neighborhood guru in the development where he lives. And he gets supported on the back end by me in the state of Washington, 3,000 miles away. And he forgets there's a 3-hour time difference. So when it's 9 a.m. in Florida, it's 6 a.m. in Seattle, and I get this wake-up call, what are you doing? Well, Dad, I'm sleeping. It's already 9 o'clock. Not here, it isn't 9 o'clock. Well, listen, now I've got you up. Let me explain to Ethel's having a problem with her computer. And Ethel is one of the neighbors that he's convinced all the neighbors it's really, really good to do email on the internet. So he starts describing all these things, brought a brand new $299 US Dell system through the TV special, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was working fine when she got it. It was a 2.6 gigahertz machine, really, really fast. And the past couple weeks has been going slower and slower and slower. Now, I'm half awake, not fully clothed, but the word spyware pops out immediately. So I suggest, well, go to one of a half dozen websites, download one of the spyware detectors, and check it out. And I said, if that doesn't work, let me know, because I'll be down in Florida in 2 weeks, and I'll check it out. He didn't do that. Waited till I got there, because he wanted his expert, and of course we all know there's no such thing as an expert in IT anymore, because there's just so much going on. His expert was going to check out the system. I went over to Ethel's house. I mean, she gave me my cup of tea, and just so thankful I was down there doing the personal work on her computer system. Matter of fact, my dad billed it as the White House guy is coming to fix your computer. The government deployed him on your behalf. I get in there, and literally, there must have been 1,000 some odd different applications just running. Gator and Exupiter and stuff that I thought was dead years ago was still popping up on her machine. So I sat there, and I explained to her what happened. And I cleaned a lot of it off, and she was actually disappointed. And I couldn't understand this more forlorn look on her face. She said, you know what, when I first bought that thing, as all of us know, on the DSL and cable modem, there's a little light that flashes on and off as it transmits data. When she first got it, and she's paying $49 a month US, the light didn't go on very much. But as they got more infected with spyware, the light blinked a lot. She felt she was getting her money's worth out of it for a change. And she asked me if I could make it that the light would blink a whole lot. And so when we talk about these sort of things, we talk about owning the system. You know, there's a classic example. She was thankful that the light was blinking on and off. When generally we think that's a bad thing in the business that we're in today. So basically, you know, it goes to the issue about we should never ever, you know, you go beyond the core kernel, you look at the application layer, you look at the ability and the necessity to secure much more than just the computer operating system itself. The other thing I think that's new in the environment we live in today in the new enterprise world is data resides everywhere. I would presume in this organization, this group right now, there's probably a fair number of you that carry a portable computer system with you. And I'm not going to embarrass anyone by asking how many of you actively use strong encryption on your laptop. Or the second part of that question would be, if someone came in here and yelled, we have to evacuate because of a potential fire and leave all equipment behind, you come back and find your laptop is missing, how many people would say, uh-oh, we're in trouble now? We have personal data, which we need to be worried about, banking information. We have, in some cases, customer lists, databases, layers, you know, you name the different types of data that resides on a piece of hardware this size anymore. And so what my point in all this is we have to remember the low-tech solutions, the physical security of assets. I told a story in London yesterday, for those, one or two of you might have been there. I recently bought a new pair of eyeglasses, went into what I don't consider a high-tech organization, and that's an eye doctor's office. And they took all my information, took my medical information, took my address, my credit card information, put it into their local computer system, and 2 weeks later, magically, I got new eyeglasses and very happy with them. And about a month later, I got this letter in the mail that said, "Dear Mr. Schmidt, we regret to inform you, but in conformance with HIPAA, the Healthcare Privacy Portability Act, we must notify you that someone broke into our office and stole our computer system, in which that was your personal information, your credit card information, you know, the myriad of things that one would get basically when they're transacting a health transaction, which for the life of me, I've yet to figure out why a healthcare provider needs to know my personal social security number, my government ID number, but they did. And I presume from my background in law enforcement, it was just a theft of opportunity where a burglar goes in and sells the computer system for $20 and goes buy drugs or whatever burglars do with their money. But just the fact that this happened in a local system, I was thinking, well, yes, that's part of the new enterprise. And so I got the letter. One, I was very appreciative of that, because I would much rather know that I have to watch my credit report and watch what's going on in the transaction than not. But then I rang them up and I said, well, listen, I said, thank you for sending me the letter. But my question is, was the data you stored on that computer, was it encrypted? And no surprise, I think, to anyone in this room, the answer was, what's encryption? And as I tried to explain to the office manager what encryption was, she goes, well, you need to call corporate headquarters because I'm the office manager. I set up appointments. I make sure the credit cards and the insurance claims are all filed. And I was told that, you know, you push F9, you put in customer data, you push F10 to save it, and that's the extent of training they've had. Yet the data repository in that physical asset was comparable to what we would have in a major hospital. So it's not any different at all. So we have to make sure that we're doing the physical security as well as the logical security as well, because oftentimes that becomes the weak point. Another thing I want to touch on briefly, because I do want to leave at least 10 minutes or so for some discussion here, and that's the whole identity management issue. We are now starting to convene dialogues with government and private industry folks about how are we going to deal with identity management. You all familiar with the choice points and the card systems and all the things that have occurred in the U.S. There's been a few in other regions of the world relative to 40 million users have their data potentially compromised. And I use the word potential because in some cases there was direct proof that it was, other cases it was just suspected, missing tapes, et cetera. But when you look at the failure of some of these systems and it goes back, it's how are we doing identity management today? My computer recognizes me in many cases as Howard AS and then some password. Now, what are some of the spyware things doing out there? They're doing keyloggers. What are they doing? They're grabbing passwords. What are some of the spam and the phishing sites doing? They're there to design to grab the credit card information, mother's maiden name, bank PIN number, CVV number, et cetera, and passwords. We have a system that by all accounts should have been declared dead a few years ago, use of passwords, but yet we still continue to do it. The good news is we're starting to see, particularly in the European region, the take-up of two-factor authentication of the normal way to do banking. As a matter of fact, in some countries now, it's mandatory. If you're going to do online banking, you must use two-factor authentication. In the U.S., we're starting to see some of it. AOL, for example, now offers as a premium service something called passcode, which is nothing more than an RSA Secure ID token. It changes the number every 60 seconds. E-Trade, one of the big online brokerage houses, now offers that to their people that have more than $50,000 US in the account as a free service that you can actually use that to log in. In the Department of Defense in the U.S., we have what we call the CAC cards, Combination Access Card. It becomes our military, and I'm with the Reserve Forces at the Computer Crime Section at U.S. Army, and it's our military ID card, but also, if you notice, has the smart card chip in the middle. And I have some options at this juncture. I can either type in a 14-character password, it needs to be changed every 60 days, a complex password, by the way, or stick this card in the card reader and type in a 6-digit PIN that I don't have to change. Guess which I opt for? It's a no-brainer. But we need to move forward on a broader basis. We have to actually start looking for ways to make that more acceptable. And when I sat in a board meeting one day and talked about the RSA Secure ID token and had a senior executive who was a board member of a very large public company sat there and pounded his fist on the table and said, that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Number one, it requires too many mouse clicks to do that extra work. It's easier to type in, use the same password for every system you have. We all know that's fundamentally flawed, but that was the concept. And the second thing was, I've tried this and it doesn't work. Now, how many here, by the way, are familiar with the Secure ID token? A number of you are. For those of you who are not, of course, on the front there's this rotating 6-digit character that takes place based on a time synchronization format that changes every 60 seconds. On the back of it, there's a serial number that registers it to the identification management server that basically synchronizes, so when you type it in with this particular combination, it knows that you're the true authentication of the system that you're going into. This individual is trying to read that 7-digit number on the back of it and typing it in, and it wouldn't work. And felt because that was too difficult, we should never do that in a corporate environment. We shouldn't ask end users like my 90-year-old dad to do something like that, which is fundamentally flawed. Identity management on a comprehensive basis across the new enterprise is something that we need to depend on, and we need to depend on sooner than later. And we need to take the steps in the IT security business, in the universities, to go actually and affect that change and convince people that a good business model is to do good security. To protect privacy, have better security. Because as Mary and I were talking last night, not only without security you have no privacy, but also privacy is a goal. Security is just a means by which to accomplish it. And that's the way we need to move forward. And in closing, and this is almost heresy in some circles, but I will say it nonetheless, particularly I'm the proverbial early adopter. I buy the things when they're 300 pounds, brand new, knowing 6 months later they're going to be 45 pounds. But they're neat and they're exciting and they're new technology. But technology is not solely a panacea for all the things we're looking at in the area of security and privacy. Where there's a certain level of technology we have to apply, writing more secure code, doing better vulnerability assessment, doing better management, and integrating security into the day-to-day operational processes of an IT operation. But clearly making sure we have policies, the education, the training to take place, is just as vitally important as anything else. So my closing comment is when it comes to technology, security is everyone's responsibility, but it's like the other PPT, and I don't mean PowerPoint. It's the people, the process, and the technology that make the difference. If we employ all these things together, we will not be having negative conversations in the future. We'll be having the positive conversations about how far we've come in a relatively short period of time to make things more secure, more private, and more reliable and dependable on what we do on a day-to-day basis. So with that, I thank you once again for the opportunity to share these thoughts with you today. Thank you.